Thank you very much. Thank you, Kim. It's a real honor to be here with so many committed and distinguished reporters and media activists and peace activists, and yes, I have never seen so many buttons as I did during the book signing out there, you in particular. And it's great to be at this conference. I gather, although I just arrived about an hour and a half ago, that it's been a really good conference. Has it? Yes. That's good. It's so needed. I want to begin by sharing a story. I wonder how many of you here know the name Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi. How many people? Raise your hands. Not many. Abir was a 14-year-old girl living with her family about 50 miles south of Baghdad, trying to grow up as best she could in a country ravaged by war and violence. That is until March 12, 2006, when she was killed. On that night, 5 American soldiers, dressed all in black, burst into the home where Abir lived with her family. After spending the evening drinking whiskey mixed with energy drinks and playing cards, the soldiers allegedly decided to execute the crime they had been planning for weeks. The men took turns raping 14-year-old Abir before shooting her. In the next room, her mother, her father, and her 5-year-old sister were executed. And when the men were done, apparently they drenched the bodies in kerosene and set them on fire. Then they went back to base and grilled up some chicken wings for dinner. It was months before their crime came to light. The cold-blooded murder of Abir and her family is a tragedy, but it's almost as great a tragedy when her story and all the other stories that are difficult to hear and difficult to accept are buried in the back of news pages, quickly shuffled off the nightly news by politicians and their handlers, desperate to change the subject, or never told at all. Like many of you, like many Americans, I have felt frustrated and betrayed by the state of the mainstream media in this country, a media whose priorities seem out of step with their responsibilities. We need a media that strengthens democracy, not a media that strengthens the government. We need a media that enriches public discourse, not one that enriches corporations. When we talk about reforming the media, what we're really talking about is creating a media that is powerful, not a media that serves the interests of the powerful, a media that is so powerful that it can speak for the powerless, bear witness to those who are invisible in our world, and memorialize those who will be forgotten. A truly powerful media is one that can stop a war, not start one. Oh, that's good, I can see. Keep the lights up. Keep the lights up. Bill Moyers said at this very conference last year, the quality of democracy and the quality of journalism are deeply entwined. I know that you know that when the media doesn't reflect the vibrant diversity of people on this planet, both the quality of journalism and the quality of our democracy suffer. Our shared goal of creating a truly progressive democratic media, vital, fair, investigative, and truth-telling, is ultimately unreachable if we do not address the persistent, pervasive inequalities that exist in media. Inequalities that exist even outside of mainstream media, even in the alternative and independent press, I'm sorry to say. which is one of the reasons I wanted to be here. We got to get a little estrogen up here on this stage. As all of you here know, the existence of independent media has been severely threatened. I know that lots of speakers during this conference have talked about it. We've seen a new concentration of media ownership. Heck, I've been married to it. I saw it happening in my very own bed. The erosion and elimination of federal regulations that promoted a diversity of viewpoints, this has weakened our country morally, physically, and spiritually. The free press has done a great deal to show how people of color have increasingly been marginalized as media monopolies grow, how ownership of television and radio stations by people of color is at its lowest level since the government began keeping track, how a scant 13% of newspapers in this nation employ people of color in the same percentage as their readerships, and how issues affecting diverse communities have been underreported and ignored. But the media environment that is overwhelmingly white is also overwhelmingly male. Today, I hope to show you that a media that leaves women out is fundamentally, crucially flawed. Because if you can't tell the whole story, when you leave out half the population. Healthcare, Social Security, bankruptcy laws, education, minimum wage, war and peace, all these things and many more affect women differently than they do men. All issues are women's issues. And yet, the absence of women in the media is glaring. From the reporter's desk to the executive suite, women are missing. Just 1/3 of news items, and this includes print, broadcast, and internet news, cite a female source. During the coverage of the 2004 election, journalists were more than twice as likely to turn to a male source than to a woman. When you switch on the political talk shows on Sunday morning, only 1 in 9 guests is a woman, and women are more likely to be relegated to the back half of the shows when fewer people are watching. The op-ed pages are notoriously barren of female voices. Women's viewpoints are regarded as supplemental rather than essential to the story. Too often there's an unspoken quota of one. I'm sure you've all observed this phenomenon. If there's one woman op-ed writer, if there's a Maureen Dowd or an Ann Applebaum, or if there's one person of color on staff reporting on issues important to minority communities, then the quota's filled. One reason for this is because women usually aren't the ones calling the shots. Women news directors manage only 1/4 of TV newsrooms and account for fewer than 10% of board members of the major media and communications companies. And astonishingly, women only hold 3% of so-called clout titles, positions with the power to determine budgets and make decisions. These numbers have hardly changed since 1999. In the past 8 years, there's been almost no increase in women in the newsroom in both print and television news. And the sad fact is, most people don't even realize there's a problem. After decades of activism, I've come to see how deeply our lives, our politics, and the choices we are allowed to make are dictated by gender. The media didn't create gender stereotypes, but it reinforces and perpetuates them. And I believe the absence of an understanding of the role gender plays in everything allows inequality to continue on in silence. Gender inequality is so deeply ingrained in our culture that we tend to consider it a fact of life, as something that can be explained away by bogus biology or deterministic arguments. This is the real danger of conservatism. Not so much its resistance to change, but its denial of even the possibility of change. But we can change things, and we must. Which brings me to the Women's Media Center. Like a lot of you, I was despondent after the 2004 election, and Gloria Steinem and Pat Mitchell and Jessica Neuwirth and a number of other women were together in Tarrytown, New York at a seminar, and talking about, there was a poll that came out that showed that 75% of the American people who voted for George Bush thought they were voting for the exact opposite of what he stood for. Thought that, in fact, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Thought that he supported the Kyoto Protocol and so forth. We had every reason to be despondent. And so we decided that the time had come to challenge the status quo. Joining with other media activists, scholars, and professionals, we created the Women's Media Center to make change happen. The Women's Media Center has two missions. The first is to make women visible, to ensure that the concerns and opinions of the female half of the world are seen and heard in all media. The second is to make women powerful, to support and assist women media professionals as they advance to the highest levels of their fields, in print and on the radio, on television, and in the film industry, in advertising and public relations, in publishing, and on the internet. There are many media enterprises produced by women for women. Cable's Oxygen Network, To the Contrary on PBS, magazines like Bust, Bitch, and Ms., organizations like Women in Media and News, websites like feminist.com and Women's E-News, and countless others, too many to name. There is no shortage of terrific writers and editors and journalists and scholars who report women's experiences fairly, accurately, and passionately. When we created the Women's Media Center, our goal was not to add another voice to the chorus. What we want to be is a megaphone. We want to be the infrastructure that can monitor, coordinate, facilitate, and amplify women's role in the media. The first thing we did was to create Greenstone Media, the women's radio, Greenstone Radio. It's, if you want to hear it streaming, it's in 12 sites so far around the country. It's greenstonemedia.net. But then we created a website, womensmediacenter.com. It's very cool. It links to daily headlines and breaking news. We also offer our own exclusives and original content. Last spring, we broke the story of the attempt to ban abortions in South Dakota. WomensMediaCenter.com knits together the universe of women's media, linking to female columnists and bloggers, women's media organizations, and other news sources. As Gloria Steinem put it, she's so quotable. God. If we don't learn to use the media, mainstream and alternate, global and local, and by use I mean monitor, infiltrate, replace, protest, teach with, create our own, whatever the situation demands, we will not only be invisible in the present, but absent from history's first draft, unquote. This goes not only for feminists, but for all true progressives. I'm sure that some of you have heard of the Leadership Institute. That's the right-wing think tank and boot camp in Virginia that has coached all the right-wing talking heads that you can imagine, including Karl Rove and all of them. There's not a one. Ralph Reed, they all came through there. Susan Coulter. They stick to the party line. They're trained in what to say. They're taught how to do it. It's like $1 million a month budget. 80% of expert guests on TV news comes from far-right think tanks like the Leadership Institute. Knowing this, it's no surprise that we've had a hard time framing the issues and setting the terms of the debate. As progressives, one of our tactics must be to forge alliances that challenge the disproportionate influence of these far-right groups in the media. And so at the Women's Media Center, collaboration is our weapon of choice. In August of 2005, we worked with Mother Jones Magazine to help them create a special issue on violence against women. And as the chronicle of Hurricane Katrina and the Levee failure in New Orleans continues to be written, we're working with the Journalism and Women's Symposium, the Ms. Foundation, and Common Ground to make sure that women's experiences aren't left out of history's first draft. The Ms. Foundation has commissioned a reporter to gather women's stories of living through the storms and their long aftermath. The disastrous conditions that so many women still face more than a year later. These stories will appear on our site as well as the Ms. site, and we'll continue to report on this until these women have recovered from the devastation. And because a good pitch can mean the difference between a front-page story and one that never sees print, in partnership with other organizations, the Women's Media Center is creating a rapid response mechanism to pitch women's stories with women as sources. And we're also working alongside Women's e-News to promote op-ed pieces. I should emphasize that the Women's Media Center is really a center, a place for media professionals and consumers to come together in New York City. You should stop by. We're in the Empire State Building. Stop by and see us. We've brought top producers and bookers in the television industry together to talk about increasing women's presence in the news. We host a luncheon series, and we provide a workspace for journalists and reporters. We're doing media training. We have a program called The Bridge, which helps rural women, women of color, to learn how to use the media, how to do press conferences, and so forth. If you take, good. If you take away anything from what I'm saying today, I want you to leave with an awareness of the inequity that is so invisible precisely because it is so much in plain sight. Double standards that are so pervasive and so ingrained that we mistake them for the truth. I would like you to resume your work with a greater awareness of the ways that a media that scrambles to tell both sides of a story often leaves out women's side of the story. It's kind of funny. It's an odd irony that a media establishment that prides itself on balance forgets that the world is not only divided between right and left, liberals and conservatives, red states and blue. It's also divided by race and by gender. It's divided between women and men. And there's more than two sides to every story. I don't want to leave the impression that there's an official feminist spin. I wish there were, though. But or that if news is reported by a woman or written by a woman, that somehow makes things equal. You know, I'm not going to name names, but there are women out there who serve as ventriloquists for the patriarchy, right? And not coincidentally, in our current media landscape, these women are likely to be asked to comment on issues affecting other women. When I talk about women's stories, I'm talking about a plurality of perspectives, women's unique perspectives, authentic voices that express women's real concerns, the truths of our experience, the obstacles we face. That's one of the problems of having mostly men as programmers. It's hard to program for people that you don't look like, that you don't think or feel like. Stories that are often edited out or pushed to the margins in a 24-hour news cycle that shines its spotlight on celebrity pregnancies, but not on challenges to reproductive rights. That lavish attention on Condoleezza Rice's exercise routine, but buries stories on women's increasingly difficult lives in Iraq and Afghanistan in the back of the morning paper. In conclusion, allow me to give a few examples to sketch a picture of what the world might look like if the female half of the world had an equal share in the media. Well, I'll tell you one big thing that would look different. Women would actually begin to feel that they matter. You know, we're not even always conscious of it. You know, it's like gendering God as a male. Come on. And yet it's been around for so long that we don't pay any attention, and very insidiously we internalize that. If God is male, then men are God and women are at the bottom. And when women are not reflected equally in the media, we tend to unconsciously absorb that into our psyches, and we feel that we're not quite as worthy as he is. This past summer, in separate incidences, 2 young women were raped and murdered in Manhattan. The mainstream media harped on the dangerous and irresponsible actions of the young women because they went out at night to a bar, stopping just short of saying they got what was coming to them. If the female half of the world were visible and powerful, those articles would not have scolded women's so-called misbehavior. They would have focused on the real issue, male violence against women. Last month in the Washington Post, there was a heartbreaking article by Nancy Trios about women's lives in Iraq. The headline was, "Women Lose Ground in the New Iraq. Once they were encouraged to study and work. Now life is just like being in jail." The article was on page A12. If the female half of the world were visible and powerful, that article would have been the lead story on the front page and above the fold. And to return to Abir al-Janabi's tragic story, the U.S. Army wants us to believe that what happened to Abir was just another tale of a few bad apples. One of the soldiers allegedly responsible, the purported ringleader, Private Stephen Green of Midland, Texas, had a criminal record and a history of drug abuse and emotional problems. Once, the Army would have rejected him, but in 2005, desperate for recruits, they dismissed his dangerous past by granting him a so-called moral waiver and accepted him into their ranks. The Women's Media Center is the only source to keep investigating and focusing on the moral waiver that allowed Private Green to be trained to kill with submachine guns and rocket launchers. If the female half of the world were visible and powerful, the media would report this as the hypocrisy it is. The media would report that far from being the exception, brutal violence and rape are the wages of war and always have been. War always falls most cruelly and heavily on women and children. That war may occasionally make heroes, but most often it makes victims. I'm not saying that there won't be any more young girls who lose their lives before they really have had a chance to live, but that we would have the power to transform the conditions that make rape and violence and war so tragically common. This is not just about breaking glass ceilings. This is revolution. And we all have to, it's important that we all really understand something. The opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's democracy. And a media that leaves women out of the picture harms everyone, male and female. No major national or international problem, from the environment to refugee crisis to healthcare to overpopulation, from the economy to violence and crime, can be approached effectively without including the needs, views, and talents of the female half of the population. The only way to build a powerful independent media, a media that can be a force for truth, for change, and for progress, is to build an equitable media. And change can't happen without change makers like all of you. That's why I'm here. That's why I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. So go out and change things. Thank you.